the Better Satellite World podcast. I'm Tamara Bond-Williams, sitting in for Louis Saccarilla, and this is the closing episode of Safe Space, part of our topical campaign around reducing the risks of space. The campaign is underwritten by the Space Shuttle Children's Trust Fund, with additional support for the podcast series from Momentous Space. SSPI is also grateful for the ongoing support of our corporate partners, Access Intelligence, who are the publishers of Via Satellite and Satellite Today, Hughes Network Systems, the law firm of K&L Gates, and Mansat. And of course, SSPI relies on the support of our 3,000 members around the globe. So thank you. You know, we had several different ideas for today's podcast, but for some reason, this episode just would not come together. Now, I tend to be a little bit on the religious side, and so kind of took it as a sign that I should do what was in my heart to do anyway. And so I ask for your indulgence while I take a moment. I want to take a moment to really hone in on the purpose for the Reducing the Risks of Space campaign. I want to take a moment to pay tribute to those men and women who lost their lives in pursuit of human spaceflight. Space is inherently risky, and there's no aspect of the work we do in space and satellite that is not fraught with risk. We understand risk as being part of the process. We honor the mistakes as part of the journey. Rockets will fail. Landers will run out of gas and crash. Satellite signals will go dark, and then there's all that debris. Just the other day, the state of Florida implemented a law limiting the ability to sue. They limited liability on private spaceflight. And that was right on the heels of the explosion of the SpaceX Starship. We, as they say, live in interesting times. And my hat is off, as it were, to all the humans across the globe who spend precious years of their life working hard to get it right. We rightly honor the best of our industry, the young professionals with their energy and enthusiasm and ideas and courage, who come into this industry with an eagerness to see that better satellite world that this podcast is pointing the way towards. And we are thrilled always to honor the amazing veterans of our industry whose genius, whose commitment, whose life work is to create this industry that we now all enjoy. But with the joy of building, creating, problem solving, exploring, we must remember that though risk is inherent, it is incumbent upon all of us to do all in our power to mitigate that risk, whatever that risk may be. It could be space debris. It could be our own behaviors. It could be complacency. There's all kinds of things that could go wrong in an industry where so much is at stake, including human lives. In this podcast, in this podcast series, we've had a chance to consider the risk of sexual exploitation in space, the actual stakes mounting against our industry as space debris becomes more and more of a problem with no immediately easy ways to solve it. We've considered what it means to go out in space and to have an entire bureaucracy have to confront failure. This is all the lessons learned and learning that we're going through and that we have to go through in order to succeed. And along the way, we have lost lives. And so, in gratitude for their service, for the trail they blazed in their lives and in their death, I ask you to pause with me to remember and to recognize the brave souls who have lost their lives creating our soon coming spacefaring era. And with that, so this podcast is called Lost in Space. It is in memory of those who have gone before us. Soyuz 1, April 24, 1967. Cosmonaut Vladimir Mikhailovich Komarov lost his life when his parachute failed to deploy on reentry. There was so much controversy around this particular flight. He himself, it is said, thought that the flight was not ready, that there were problems, and that he ought not to have to go up. But in service to his country, he obeyed the command to go. And in that is a lesson for all of us through all of humanity. Safety first. We honor him. X-15 Flight 191, November 15, 1967. Michael Adams, who was considered a U.S. Air Force astronaut as opposed to a NASA astronaut, lost control of his flight, whether it was a mechanical control failure or whether he himself became disoriented in flight is unknown. However, upon the loss of the flight, the flight did in fact crash and he perished. He received his astronaut wings, however, from the Air Force posthumously, and that was because his final flight actually did exceed 50 miles in altitude. Soyuz 11, June 30, 1971. Cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Viktor Patsayev, and Vladislav Volkov. Again, this was a preventable error for reasons that I'm not clear on. There was a decision that they would not have to wear spacesuits while in flight. And consequently, when a valve unexpectedly and accidentally opened, either through impact of some kind, we don't know, I don't know, their cabin decompressed and they lost consciousness and died. We honor them. I remember where I was on January 28, 1986. I was in my college dorm watching with excitement for the launch of the Challenger. This was the Challenger's 10th voyage. I was in the habit of coming home or rushing to the television whenever it took off. On that particular day, launch booster failure caused the vehicle to disintegrate during the launch process, and we lost Francis Dick Scobie, who was a U.S. Air Force engine mechanic. He took night courses to complete a degree from the University of Arizona, which I mentioned because that is, in fact, my son's alma mater. He had successfully flown the Challenger, piloted the Challenger on her 5th voyage, and was the commander of this, the 10th and fatal voyage. Commander Michael J. Smith was the crew pilot and commander in the U.S. Navy, and he had been educated at the U.S. Naval Academy. Dr. Judith A. Resnick was one of the mission specialists aboard the Challenger and had previously flown to space aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery. Dr. Ronald E. McNair was also a mission specialist on this flight and also a Space Shuttle veteran, having flown the Challenger for her fourth voyage. The second ever African American in space, Dr. McNair was also a member of the historically Black fraternity Omega Psi Phi, and he was also a member of the Baha'i faith, like myself. So I have a deep identification with Dr. McNair. Lieutenant Colonel Ellison S. Onizuka was the third mission specialist on the flight, and his mission was most likely classified. He actually was serving on the Challenger on behalf of the Department of Defense. He was Japanese American, born in Hawaii. Gregory B. Jarvis was actually an employee of Hughes Aircraft Corporation, and he was a payload specialist for this flight. Hughes had sponsored his participation in the astronaut program, and he was there to learn about designs for liquid-fueled rockets. And most beloved at that time was Sharon Krista McAuliffe, who was our first teacher in space. She won that opportunity out of a pure passion for teaching children and wanting to encourage children to pursue careers in STEM education. The organization by Teachers in Space is still in existence, by the way. Columbia Mission STS-107, February 1st, 2003. By 2003, the space shuttle program had begun to feel like air flight. We were used to it. I missed its flight. But on that fateful day, we lost a crew, and this loss actually shuttled the space shuttle program permanently. We are very grateful for their service and for the lessons learned from their sacrifice. Richard Douglas, Rick Husband, was a naval officer and aviator. He was the commander of the 28th and fatal voyage of the Space Shuttle Columbia. He was a colonel in the U.S. Air Force and a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. Yes, he was an Air Force commander, not a naval. Rather, William Cameron McCool was a U.S. naval commander, and he was the pilot of the Columbia flight STS-107. Dr. David McDowell Brown was a United States Navy captain with a doctorate in medicine. The Columbia flight was his first space flight. Dr. Kalpana Chawla was born in India, and she was naturalized in the United States in 1991. She became the first person from India to go to space. And the Columbia mission was her second mission. She had flown the Columbia previously. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Philip Anderson of the U.S. Air Force was a payload specialist aboard the Columbia, and he was in charge of science experiments as part of this mission. Captain Laurel Blair Clark was a medical doctor and mission specialist aboard the Columbia. It was her first space flight, and by the gift of modern technology, we have blessed pictures of her floating in this low gravity environment of the space shuttle. And we also have the text of her final email home from space. Colonel Ildan Ramon with the Israeli Air Force was a payload specialist aboard the fated Columbia flight and the first Israeli to go to space. These men and women sacrificed their lives in pursuit of our future. And we have this opportunity in this moment, and I thank you for sharing this moment with me to honor their lives. Ad Astra.